is one brutal sport. You enter a cage and get ready to go in for the next few minutes. It's a battle with a fellow warrior, just as strong, fast, skilled, and intelligent as you. With everything except scratching and clawing allowed, the most dominant fighters are absolutely able to end their opponents with a knockout. Unlike boxing, you don't get a 10-second timer to save you from the brutality here. Here are our picks for the most brutal and absolutely legendary MMA knockouts in the history of the sport. 10. Martin Nguyen vs. Edward Follian. 1. For those unaware, ONE Championship had been making its mark as a big competitor to the UFC, especially in Asia. ONE Championship has already proved that its fighters are far from amateurs and are also some legit stars in the MMA circuit. I would argue it even has the best Muay Thai fighters in the world fighting there. In its relatively short history, there have been some crazy knockouts in the ONE Championship scene, and our pick for the best one has to be a knockout from its current GOAT, Martin Nguyen against Edward Follian. In the battle for the lightweight world title, Edward Follian goes for a spinning back kick, but Martin Nguyen perfectly counters it with a punch, and with that punch secures himself the win. 9. Conor McGregor vs. Jose Aldo. Next up on this list, we have to talk about the fighting Irish himself, Conor McGregor. The notorious man had an insane dominant run in the featherweight and lightweight divisions, and nothing encapsulates his dominance more than his battle against Hall of Famer Jose Aldo at UFC 194. In a battle for the featherweight title, McGregor delivered some precise forward punches, and in 13 seconds, he became the new featherweight champion of the world. That KO was the perfect encapsulation of how much of a problem McGregor was back in the day, delivering that blistering quick flurry that ended the long-anticipated match in the blink of an eye. 8. Vitor Belfort vs. Lyoto Machida. A premier matchup in the middleweight division is always fun. The middleweight is amazing, and we see the perfect blend of power and speed in this weight class. We were treated to this matchup of middleweight stars at UFC 224. The knockout came in the second round of the matchup, with both fighters just in their stance waiting for the other to make a move. Machida, like Dragon, terrified the world with his insane power, throwing a perfect front kick straight into Vitor Belfort's head, handing him one of the absolute coldest knockouts in MMA history. The coldest part of the knockout? Lyoto Machida doesn't even react to the hit, just moves back looking chill and zen, like he didn't just have the most badass finish to a fight ever. 7. Ronda Rousey vs. Alexis Davis. Although sadly overshadowed by male MMA sometimes, female MMA is just as brutal and masterful as men's MMA. And the GOAT Ronda Rousey has a great example of the insane knockouts we can see in their division, with her knockout against Alexis Davis. Ronda Rousey in the first seconds of the match immediately grabs and absolutely ragdolls her, and then immediately goes to work smashing her face in, getting the dominant knockout without barely breaking a sweat. Rousey proved she was the face of women's MMA that night by proving no one at that point stood a chance against her. 6. Shevchenko vs. Eye. Our pick for the best female MMA knockout has to be this one from the women's flyweight division in UFC 238. Being the co-main event, these two didn't disappoint with all the precise striking and hits we saw throughout the contest. Shevchenko wins her very first title defense and makes a statement to the rest of the league that she's on top by absolutely wrecking Eye with a perfect head kick, dropping her like a corpse on the canvas. It doesn't matter if we're talking about male or female MMA. That kick and knockout was cold, no questions indeed. 5. Anderson Silva vs. Vitor Belfort. Anderson Silva is widely regarded as one of the GOATs for a reason. The Spider was elite out there in literally every facet of the game, and one of the best showcases of his skill is this absolute masterclass against Vitor Belfort. By the way, don't let this list fool you. Vitor Belfort has insane knockouts of his own. He just happens to have been rocked in the ring a bunch himself. Anderson Silva does what he does best, which is to play loose and dance around with a flurry of flukes, which contrasts hard against Vitor's standard stance. Anderson Silva flukes again with his hands, only to throw the perfect kick into Vitor Belfort, absolutely knocking Belfort out cold and securing his place as the middleweight title holder in dominant fashion. Silva showed off the perfect fight wherein, if Ali floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee, Silva crawled, danced around, and eventually strikes like a mean spider. 4. George St. Pierre versus Matt Hughes 2. If we're talking about the best UFC fighters, we have to talk about George St. Pierre in the second battle in what was a trilogy of UFC fights. GSP also had his coming out party as one of the greatest MMA fighters in the history of the sport. For those who remember the first fight, St. Pierre was still a really young fighter, starry-eyed and even getting the chance to fight Matt Hughes. But in the second matchup, all bets were off as we saw an absolute demo job from Rush. GSP hits Matt Hughes with an absolute bomb of a head kick and was able to secure himself the welterweight title in UFC 65. A knockout with both some power and dominance and some insane history behind it. 3. Francis Ngannou versus Alistair Overeem. This knockout is a recent one, but it's a knockout from one of MMA's greatest rising stars. In this battle of hulking heavyweights, Francis Ngannou went out and proved he's a star in this fight against Alistair Overeem in this co-main event of UFC 218. In this absolute slugfest of a bout, both fighters went at it, taking and dealing heavy hits, but Ngannou showed that he was in control throughout the fight. Alistair throws an overhead punch at Ngannou's head, which actually connects well, but Ngannou absolutely tanked the hit and throws a massive uppercut himself, knocking Overeem out and to the ground, and was luckily saved by the ref from a gorilla pounding. We hope for a long career ahead for Francis Ngannou full of knockouts that would make Mike Tyson proud. 2. Wanderlei Silva versus Rampage Jackson 2. Pride. Now, before we had Bellator and ONE today, and before UFC had truly hit its stride as the best MMA league, we had Pride. The Pride Fighting Championship was a competition in Japan with an insane amount of undercards. The fights here were in a giant square ring, in a stadium full of electric fans ready to see some amazing action. Another big part of the Pride Championship is the big difference between it and the UFC's rules. In Pride, there were no restrictions on the knees and kicks, even if the opponent was down on the ground, meaning you could literally kick someone while they were down in Pride. All of this culminated in the battle of these two MMA legends being a spectacular one. Wanderlei Silva went up against Quinton Rampage Jackson in this bout, both going in with some hard hits, tough grappling, and some big blows all over. After a brutal battle that always felt neck and neck, the second round ended with some fireworks. Silva gets the perfect right on Rampage Jackson, getting him rocked and stunned, which he then follow-ups with a clinch and some absolutely powerful knees to the head. At first, Jackson was able to clinch hard enough to avoid the brunt of the kicks, but Silva gets one perfectly fitted into the middle, knocking Jackson to sleep. You can tell those were some giant hits when you had one of the toughest MMA fighters slumped down on the ropes looking half dead. The entirety of that battle was already electric, but that finish was truly the cherry on top. 1. Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren. And our pick for the greatest knockout has to be the absolutely iconic Masvidal versus Ben Askren fight. In what was only Ben Askren's second fight in the UFC, having fought in one championship a majority of his career, Masvidal, a grizzled vet of the UFC who had his start fighting in nightclubs, gave Ben Askren a rude awakening. Ben had come into the UFC talking a lot of smack, and he and Masvidal were into some real beef before the fight even started. Askren had one win in the UFC at that point, but a lot of fans had issues with it as it was a wrong call by the ref accidentally calling a tap on Ben Askren's submission on Robbie Lawler. In what people were expecting to be a long battle full of blows from Masvidal and grappling and wrestling from Ben Askren, Masvidal makes history. Bell sounds, and with a running start, Masvidal absolutely nails Ben Askren with a flying knee to the face, knocking him out, and in 5 seconds from the bell ringing, Masvidal wins the fight with one perfect flying knee. This knockout will forever be an iconic finish that is a reminder to any fighter that they don't play around in the UFC. Any dominant and insane knockout that we forget? Comment down in the comments section your favorite knockout below. And while you're at it, hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell notification for the newest videos on the best sports news and content.